The following tape was made with Senator Henry Bellmon, August 16, 1971.
Headliners, a discussion with the people who make the news, a public affairs presentation of the Oklahoma News Network.
I'm Bob Douglas, and our guest today on Headliners is Oklahoma's Republican Senator Henry Bellmon. Welcome to Headliners.
Thanks, Bob. I'm glad to be back in Oklahoma.
First of all, you're here in Oklahoma to look at our drought situation, which is quickly becoming one of the worst in several years. What do you think the situation is? How serious is it?
Well, Bob, it's very serious. Fortunately, up to now, cattle prices haven't broken too much, but this could certainly happen if farmers begin to have to move their foundation herds. The feed situation is serious, and this is certainly something that is going to make a real difference in the economy of our state, and something that we need to begin to take steps to alleviate. We're trying to figure out every way we can to get as much help for farmers who are caught up in this problem as is possible. And as you probably know, a large number of counties in the state have been declared to be disaster areas, so that the farmers can graze their layout land, and hopefully this way make it possible for them to hold their herds together.
Now, this is land they do not normally use under a land bank program? This
is land that that the federal farm programs require the farmers to set aside and not harvest. And in some cases, this land has been planted to feed crops, or maybe in Bermuda grass or some other forage that will help the farmer get the herds through this very dry and hot period.
You have a plan that you hope to get underway concerning a way to avoid situations like dry farmlands. Could you explain it?
Well, Bob, here's a problem. Even though the present program is helpful, it leaves a lot to be desired, because in a year like this, when it's very hot and very dry, the forage production is low on both the lands that farmers ordinarily crop and on the so-called layout lands. We're proposing, we're going to try to amend the Farm Bill to provide for the establishment of a feed bank. All this amounts to is permission for a farmer to go ahead and raise forage on his layout land and harvest it and store it. And then we're going to put it under a kind of a seal so that he won't be able to use it until the Secretary of Agriculture holds that we have an emergency situation. And when this happens, and these feeds that have been produced in the good years, not in the bad years, but in the good years when we have normal production, can be made available. And that way a farmer will have a kind of an insurance policy on his own farm, and when he gets into trouble like this, and he can go ahead and open that sealed forage that he has stored and use it. And I think this will tend to stabilize the agricultural income of the state, and to make it possible for farmers to set up a balanced livestock program and carry it along, even though we do have years when the rainfall is way below normal.
Well, Oklahoma is normally dry in the summer. Is this a serious enough situation, often enough, that it would warrant a feed bank?
I don't have the figures in front of me, but there are counties in Oklahoma and some parts of Oklahoma that are in a dry situation almost every year, and it isn't only our state. I put the figures in the Congressional Record earlier this week that shows that some years there may be as many as 35 states in this country that have these emergency situations. I think the smallest number of states that we've had since, say, 1965 have been 14. In other words, there were only 14 states, I think, last year where we had enough bad weather, enough dry weather, so that they were declared to be disaster areas. But it's a very normal thing in agriculture, not only here, but in such states even as Michigan and South Carolina and Louisiana, for the rains to be below normal. And when this happens, and feed production is down, and farmers feel the pinch. So we feel that by setting up a feed bank that will give a farmer a chance to grow feed in a normal year and have it when the rain doesn't come will be a real stabilizing influence in the farm economy.
Now, you've got some preliminary indications, but you really haven't put your figures together yet. What do you feel that a drought of the proportions that this is quickly becoming will have on the economy of Oklahoma?
Oklahoma's two major crops are wheat and cattle. The wheat crop, of course, came off ahead of the drought. We harvest our wheat mostly in June. So the wheat crop was was normal or perhaps a little above normal in most sections of the state. I haven't actually seen a report as just what the final yield was. The cattle prices are good. Now the weights are likely to be down, so I would say that up to now we haven't had the drought has not caused a serious blow in our farm income, although this is certainly likely to happen, particularly the cotton crop and perhaps in some areas to soybeans later on and to peanuts. But up to now the cattle prices have stayed good, and unless we do have a decline in cattle prices, this may not cause too much of an income disaster for farmers. At least I hope it won't.
So far as irrigation and holding water for future purposes is concerned, you're in a difficult position on something like the controversy that's currently going on the Glover River and the Luke Fada Dam down there. The conservationists say they don't want the dam because it'll destroy one of our last free-flowing rivers. The farmers, on the other hand, say they need it, well, for the water that it'll provide. Where do you stand on the Glover River?
The controversy hopefully can be settled to the desires perhaps of both groups. The plan that is now under consideration, or that has been under consideration, was drawn up many years ago before the interest the conservationists have in the river had been expressed. And it is possible, at least I think it's possible, to devise a plan to control the floods which the residents of the area want to see done, and not destroy the river system as the conservationists now know it and find it to be of such value. I recognize the fact that a stream like this has great potential for the storage of water, for instance, for municipal or industrial use, and there may be a time when we need this, but again, I think this can be accomplished without destroying the whole river system. So at the moment, we're trying to figure out a way to stop the flooding and to salvage the water that the river system produces each year and still leave it in a condition that will provide recreational opportunities for those who look to the river for this use.
Is that to say there may be a third alternative between a dam and not a dam?
There may be the alternative of putting a dam, or maybe perhaps more than one dam, up the river further than the present Luke Fatka site. I don't have there's no decision yet on this, but it seems possible that this might be worked out.
Another thing that the drought is beginning to do is we've turned up a lot of fish kills and sudden pollution, and the Water Resources Board Corporation Commission officials seem to believe that at least half of it is caused by the drought and low flow water flow conditions. That for instance, we just had a situation where waste was being dumped into a river, but there wasn't enough water to dilute it. Oklahoma's always had a public relations program that we are a pollution-free state, or as nearly so as can be gotten in these days and times. Do you think that situations like this will hurt our image?
It certainly won't do our image any good. But even in spite of these problems, Oklahoma still has probably about as large a supply of non-committed potable water as any state in the Union. These problems certainly don't help us any, and they need to be corrected, and I'm sure that the authorities that have responsibility to deal with the problems are taking steps to see that they're corrected. But compared to many states, we're still in very good shape. I might say, Bob, on this subject, we've been contacted by some residents over around the Keystone Reservoir who are concerned about the purging of some of these old oil wells in the Keystone. This is apparently a very serious pollution problem, and I've asked Russell Train, who has the President's Environmental Advisory Council, to take a look at this and see what he can do. The problem is not caused by industry, but rather comes about because the Corps of Engineers built the Keystone Dam without making certain that some of these old oil wells were adequately plugged. And now that the dam is built and the lake is filled up, they're purging oil, which coats quite a large section of one of the arms of the lake, and it spreads. It's almost a miniature Santa Barbara situation. And here's a case where it looks like the federal government's going to have to figure a way to come in and correct one of its mistakes. So these problems, I feel, are being dealt with, and we certainly want to make certain that Oklahoma keeps its good reputation in the field of water quality control.
We've had a situation develop where either through unwillingness of different divisions or the way our laws are set up, there doesn't seem to be any real way of penalizing a company that is clearly violating the law. Would you suggest a change either in the laws or in the control mechanism?
I realize I've been out of state government now for the last 3.5 years, but my memory of this problem is that the basic authority resides in the Corporation Commission. This commission, of course, is made up of elected officials, and sometimes they are apparently very reluctant to take action, police action, that needs to be taken. And you'll have to reach your own conclusion as to why that's the case. And I would say that Oklahoma, unless it's changed its laws since I dealt with them, needs to place the responsibility for water quality control and enforcement in an agency that is not made up of elected officials who may have certain alliances that are very difficult, make it difficult for them to do their job once they get in office, and put it in an agency, perhaps the Health Department or the Wildlife Department or the Water Quality Control Board, or some group that has tenure and that can go ahead and make a distasteful decision if they need to, and actually enforce these water quality standards, which Oklahoma has and which are really pretty good.
Well, now we have authority in all of those, practically the Health Department, Wildlife Department, Water Resources. But
there's overlapping, and one can pass the buck to the other, and you just can't put your finger on any one agency and say, this is your job, go do it.
It has been suggested that we put it under either one agency, or if any of the, I think there are 5 different agencies, if any one of them refused for one reason or another not to prosecute, then some sort of super board or advisor could do it. Would you like to see something like that?
I would say the legislature and the governor ought to choose one agency, whether it's one of the existing agencies or whether they want to create a new one. I wouldn't know. I'd think we have enough agencies, and perhaps they ought to just pick one, perhaps maybe the Health Department, and give them the full and final authority and the necessary staff and funding so that they could have the muscle necessary to enforce these difficult regulations.
Both on a national and a local level, do you think that pollution may become something less of a political football after the elections? In other words, could we really get down to some business?
Well, Bob, the Congress has done quite a lot in the field of pollution control. By accident, yesterday I sat through the Interior Committee meeting and heard Russell Train make the report for the first year's operation of the President's Environmental Advisory Council. And while this is a new organization and it hasn't been fully staffed or fully funded at this point, they have developed quite a systematic and orderly approach to meeting a lot of the water pollution problems we have in the country. I might also say on this subject that Oklahoma is considering the establishment of an environmental laboratory to help deal with these problems. But I would say that through the different federal agencies, the Water Quality Control Board, Department of Interior, Department of Health, and the environmental agencies, and as you know, the President has just recently put together a new environmental group that will be directly under the White House control. It's taken out such things as pesticide control from the Department of Agriculture, and it has brought together the environmental or the water quality control group from Interior. All these are being put into one agency. So I think at the federal level we're moving both with the laws we need and with the administrative machinery to enforce the laws toward the day when we will be able to truly enforce water quality and air pollution standards that will help us roll back some of the bad problems that have existed and keep them from developing in the future. I might also say, just as a sideline, that earlier this week, Shirley and I were with a small group that made a little trip down the Potomac River. And I have never in my life seen such a dirty, stinking, filthy place as a Potomac River. We're literally dumping raw, untreated sewage into that river. And the smell of it is almost unbearable. In fact, we were supposed to have a meal on this boat we were on. We had to to go south of Washington, I would imagine 5 or 10 miles to get out of the odor to the point that anybody could even think of eating. It's really that bad. And I tried to impress upon Mr. Train yesterday that the federal government had a real responsibility to solve the problems right there, because those are not caused by any industry. They're caused, there's very little industry around Washington. They're caused because our own federal government isn't doing a decent job in meeting its own pollution problems. Until we can clean up our own house, we're certainly not in a very good position to throw rocks at somebody else.
That was a comment made this past week in a legislative committee that individuals won't really be very concerned until industry and business and government do something, because they can look up, for instance, litter. They're not going to be concerned about personal litter until they can see something else. On a totally different subject, you will be visited, the entire Oklahoma congressional delegation will be visited very shortly by highway officials from Oklahoma. I believe you've been contacted. And it will concern the Highway Trust Fund that is being jeopardized for Oklahoma. How serious is a move to curtail highway funds from the federal government?
Well, the big controversy here is over the Interstate Trust Fund. There are many people, highway users, and I'm sure those who build highways, who feel that not a penny of this money should ever be siphoned off for any other purpose. Now, some who are in positions of responsibility feel that there are some other areas that are consistent with the highway construction. For instance, the program to take down a lot of the billboards that have harmed the appearance of our highways and in some way detract from their safety. There's a feeling that perhaps we could use some of this money to get rid of those. And they also feel that there are some areas when perhaps some of the planning having to do with where highways would serve best and helping to plan communicate or transportation centers could be met with highway funds. I frankly feel that there is not a real threat toward taking any substantial amount or percentage of the money out of the Highway Trust Fund. I think the trust fund is not in any jeopardy, any real jeopardy, but I wouldn't want to go so far as to say that there wouldn't be some effort to succeed in taking a very small percentage of the money out of the fund to be used in kind of auxiliary enterprises that will help make the highway system better.
And of course, what most of the officials here are concerned about is the move to get it into rapid transit, which would of course do us no good whatsoever.
That probably is not going to happen.
Have you had any contact with the White House concerning the very recent curtailment of some federal funds aid to highways, whether or not we will get that money back eventually?
I've had a lot of contact with the White House and also with the Secretary of Transportation, who's incensed by this whole operation. And he tells me, and I'm not sure that this has been made public yet, that the White House is going to back down on this, that we will get the money that we're supposed to for our highway program. Now, I had lunch with John Volpe earlier this week, and he told a small group of us that this was the case. So, as I said, I'm not sure whether this has been publicly stated yet, but he felt that he had this matter worked out with the what's called now the Bureau of Management and Budget. And he actually went on a vacation, and while he was away, they announced that they were going to cut back, and he immediately ended his vacation and came back and has apparently carried on quite a personal battle over the matter, and has succeeded in getting assurances that the highway funds will be restored.
Would you like to make a prediction when? By the next quarter?
I don't have anything firm on that point.
During the week, Senator Harris came up with an idea of making the presidential election day a national holiday. I assume that you've heard of the
yes.
Proposal, and also suggested that the Census Bureau, rather than parties, be responsible for registering voters. Understanding that it was made from the opposition party and from, in effect, the opposition senator, what do you think of the proposal?
I think Senator Harris is perhaps a little uninformed or misled as to who registers voters. The registration is carried on by the county or precinct election officials who are not party functionaries, but rather paid by the state. But I really can't get ready for turning it over to the Census Bureau. I rather think we're getting into real problems when we ask a federal bureaucracy to come in, because if you have a problem with a local political group like the state senate, consider what it'd be like if you have a national partisan group, which the census group could very easily become. As you probably know, whichever party's in power generally hires the census workers. The Republicans hired them this year, and I think it would be a fantastic danger to allow this group to set up a national election. Also, I can't agree that we ought to go out and twist people's arm to get them to vote. I think every citizen should vote. He should inform himself on what the issues are, but if he doesn't want to vote, I think that's up to him. I'd like to see more people participate in elections, but I really don't feel we ought to go out and almost point a gun at somebody's head and say, go vote. If he isn't interested enough to know what the issues are and express himself, then certainly probably we are better off to have him not participate. So I think that everyone should have a right. We should make certain that there are no artificial barriers to keep people from voting, but from then on it's up to the individual citizen.
On election back here, except for the Democrats, it's been a reasonably lackluster campaign. The Democrats again seem to be having some intra-party bickering. How have the Republicans managed to keep out of the intra-party spats? There seems to be some sort of discipline there that's unspoken.
No, I don't think that's quite the reason. The actual fact is that Republicans have had a hard time in getting enough candidates to file for these offices. We don't have to fight with each other because there's enough spots to go around for anyone who's ambitious enough to run. I tell you, we may be coming up with a real Donnybrook, though, for the Senate race in '72. There are several very strong and attractive candidates who are interested in that race, and that could get to be quite a show if all of them carry through with their plans to run.
I've heard of a minimum 3, possibly 4 Republicans going after the Senate seat. Do you think that same situation could develop?
It's entirely possible. I hope it won't, because there are plenty of good positions that need Republican candidates, and perhaps some of these fellows will decide to go for some of those, and not all of them go for the same spot, but it could get to be pretty tough.
Do you think that there might be some before the race, behind the scenes?
No, I think this is a misconception a lot of people seem to have. They seem to feel that there's somebody in Oklahoma who gets Republicans all together and sort of disciplines them and tells them to line up and do certain things. I've never seen it happen, and I've been mixed up in this business now for more than 10 years. I think that, as I've said, we haven't had a big enough reservoir of qualified candidates who aspire to these jobs, and so they've been able to pick the ones they want and not to necessarily have a knockdown and drag out for the same office. But as I say, there are several who aspire to the Senate position next year in 1972, and it could get to be a real contest.
Do you think Senator Harris is in as much trouble as people are now saying?
Well, you're better able to observe than I am. People don't come around and talk to me about my colleague in the Senate, but at least there are quite a few candidates on both the Republican and Democratic tickets who think he's going to be in a vulnerable position.
Are there any in the congressional races coming up right now? Do you see any upsets in the making?
Well,
any changes in the making?
I haven't been out on the campaign trail at all this year. We've been in session up there, and probably going to stay in session until up in October. And I doubt that public attitudes toward the Congress are fully firmed up yet, but I would imagine, for instance, a fellow like Jay Wilkinson, he's a very attractive young guy, and I'm fairly sure, although I don't know, that he's worked very hard, so it isn't impossible that there could be some changes.
Okay, one of your Capitol Hill colleagues, Congressman Camp, has recently completed a survey. One of the points on that survey is that Oklahomans, at least in his district, overwhelmingly felt that there's been an unprecedented laxness concerning smut and pornography, which is again coming up. First of all, do you think the belief's widespread throughout Oklahoma? And secondly, is there anything Congress could or would or can do?
There's no question that it's widespread through Oklahoma. There's an awful lot of people in this state who get some of this terrible literature and immediately send it to their senator. We have a cabinet full of it up there. It's absolutely horrible, some of the stuff that goes in the mails. as you probably know, a real effort's been made on the part of the Congress and administration and the post office authorities to figure out some way to stop this nonsense. And some things have been done. For instance, it has to be mailed first class, and if someone gets some of this stuff, then the law allows them to write to the sender and say, don't send me any more of that junk. And if they do, if they get additional other mailings, then the sender is guilty of a violation of the law. Also, in some of the president's anti-crime proposals, there have been proposals to tighten up the law still further. So many in government are trying as best in every way they can to stop this commerce in pornography, and I believe we're making some headway, but no one's figured out a way to stop it completely.
Do you think that perhaps under the postal reform, somehow by putting the post office in its private area, that they might be able to work out a way to stop it?
I'm sure they'll do everything they can to stop it, but you get into some very difficult areas. For instance, not everyone can agree on what pornography is, and some consider some of these things to be arty. I don't have any problem, at least what I think is pornography, but I probably would stop way short of what some others would consider to be harmful. So I would say that the government is going to continue to find means of making it more and more difficult for these kinds of materials to go through the mail, and I'm confident that ultimately we will be able to solve the problem, at least as far as what we call hard pornography is concerned.
Let's jump to Vietnam just very quickly in respect to Marine Private Randy Herrod. Senators Stipe and Garrison doing what they can to delay it, to get a full investigation, as they say, of the military code of justice, which they say desperately needs an overhaul. Do you hold that same feeling? Do you think it needs an overhaul? Is it fair in your mind?
I would certainly agree that there seems to be a double standard as far as military justice as it relates to civilian casualties is concerned. We need to completely review the situation. And as you probably know, I introduced a resolution yesterday to call for a review of the military code of justice, and I hope it'll be done.
Do you have any news on your concern about the methods that corpsmen and doctors use in declaring people dead in Vietnam?
Well, you remember, of course, about the serviceman from Muskogee, I believe it's Mr. Corporal Madewell, who was being literally sacked up to be sent home as dead when he moaned, and then was taken out and treated, and is now almost, or at least he's well along toward recovery. And I wrote the Secretary of Defense and asked him to examine the procedures that made such a terribly tragic mistake possible. And we got a letter back this week, not from the Secretary of Defense, but from a doctor in the Department of Defense, who in effect said that their procedures were adequate and they didn't contemplate any changes. Well, I'm totally convinced that their procedures are not adequate. He said that in most cases a doctor examined injured servicemen and made certain that there was no hope before they were declared dead, but he said in some cases this decision was made by a corpsman. Well, I don't feel that a corpsman who perhaps hasn't been fully trained and may not be completely experienced in these matters should have to make these life and death decisions. And we're preparing now to introduce legislation or to insist that the Department of Defense take another look at this matter and try to make certain that anyone who has any hope at all of recovery is given absolutely every opportunity to be treated and saved. I really feel that the Defense Department is terribly negligent in this matter.
Senator Bellmon, it's been a pleasure having you on Headliners. Our guest today, Senator Henry Bellmon of Oklahoma, our Republican and junior senator.
Listen every week at the same time for Headliners, a discussion with the people who make the news. Headliners is a public affairs presentation of the Oklahoma News Network. The preceding program was pre-recorded.